Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our fourth and final in this series of lectures with the Nature Conservancy. Tonight's Extreme Makeover, which has been extremely popular, as you can see. I think the weather's helped too. A lot of people want to get out, so I appreciate you coming. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of you for the fourth time this season, and it's always great to have you come back, so we hope you'll join us for other things. I'd also like to thank Michigan Radio, as usual, for helping us to promote the series. We appreciate their support as well. Tonight's speaker, the Nature Conservancy's Chris May, Director of Restoration, will discuss the latest techniques in use to restore, protect, and preserve rare species and habitats in the Great Lakes. Chris joined the Nature Conservancy in 2008 and directs statewide restoration and stewardship efforts, including invasive species management, prescribed fire, habitat assessments, and capital improvements at preserves. He works closely with other conservation scientists to develop conservation plans and design and implement new projects. Currently, Chris oversees several components of a landscape-scale coastal restoration project in the western Lake Erie Basin. Chris has been involved in the research and management of wildlife and natural resources for 24 years. He received his BS in biology from Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and his MS in wildlife management from Humboldt State University. His past experience includes restoration of aquatic wetland and upland habitats, invasive species management, the collection of analysis and recaptured data, the use of GIS for natural resource management, prescribed fire and wildland firefighting, and evaluation of habitat selection by wildlife at multiple scales. Prior to joining the Conservancy, Chris spent 5 years with the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all you come out tonight to see the presentation on Extreme Makeover Nature Edition. And I also want to thank the Cranbrook Institute for partnering with the Nature Conservancy on this series. Today, I'm going to be going over 4 different sort of case studies, major restoration projects that we've done around the state, and describe in detail some of the techniques we've used and the successes that we've achieved through those projects. As Steve said, I am the Director of Restoration for the Nature Conservancy in Michigan, and so that involves, as he said, invasive species management and prescribed burning, basically making sure that our properties around the state stay in good shape or improve for the plants and animals that live there. First, a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. The mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, and that includes human uses, and our vision is to leave a sustainable world for future generations. So the presentation tonight is modeled a little bit after the Extreme Makeover show. There will be some opportunities for audience participation if you like. But basically the idea is that there's areas around the state that are in poor condition. They've been degraded for one reason or another, and through our restoration practices we improve the lands and waters there so that the animals that need those areas can thrive and be successful in reproduction and survival. Now the first project that I want to tell you about is our Ives Road Fen Preserve. This is in southeast Michigan, just south of Tecumseh. And fens are unique wetland communities, and they're unique because the water that basically sustains the plant communities percolates up from the ground, generally through limestone formations, and as a result of that it usually has very unique water chemistry. The pH is high, it's called alkaline or very basic water chemistry, and so it fosters a very unique set of plants and animals that occur there. You can see in this aerial photograph here some of the threats in the surrounding landscape, which include housing developments and agriculture. So you can see this green strip here is really unique in this particular landscape because it's some of the remaining natural areas. This particular preserve is about 700 acres in size, and about 100 acres of that is now prairie fen, and I'll tell you how we got to restoring that prairie fen. But a little bit of historical context about this property. In the 1940s, there were some major changes on the landscape that really affected the disturbance regime, the disturbance processes that really maintained the natural communities there. And so those changes were fire suppression and altered hydrology. Prairie fens are fire-dependent habitats. They require regular fires to go through for plant and animal survival and reproduction. So removing that really drastically alters the nature of the ecosystem. And then also altered hydrology. A lot of this area was converted to agricultural use, and as a result, they put in ditches and drainage tiles to lower the water table, and that also drastically changed the communities. So those changes in the disturbance regime really set the stage for the invasion of an invasive species called glossy buckthorn. And are most of you familiar with the term invasive species? Know what that is? Okay, a lot of people nodding. So up in the corner here, you can see this is glossy buckthorn. It's a shrubby plant that has very glossy, shiny leaves and these blackberries, which birds love. They love to eat them and spread them around the landscape. So by the 1970s, what existed on this particular site is what we call a buckthorn monoculture, which means there were vast expanses of the property that were buckthorn and nothing else. There was no other species growing there. And I'll show you some pictures of that, but it really diminishes the plant and animal diversity at the site. And just a little bit of history about buckthorn. It's from Eurasia, and it was brought to the U.S. as an ornamental plant. It was also brought as a visual barrier, so people could plant it between along their property line, and it just grows very thick and provides some privacy between adjacent landowners. And then in 1987, the Nature Conservancy purchased the property, and so you might ask yourself, well, there's been all this abuse and degradation of the site. Why would the Nature Conservancy buy this? And then the answer is that many of the native, rare and declining communities are in declining condition. There aren't any pristine fens left at the time. So this was one of the best places left. We saw the potential based on the plants and animals that were sort of found some refuge in the few remaining pockets of fen. We saw the potential of the site, and that's why we decided to acquire it and start restoring the fen. So for those of you who aren't familiar with invasive species, they're generally from another part of the country or another part of the world, and they're introduced or find their way to a new area by one means or another. Much of the time it's by human activity. And in the new environment, they don't have predators or the competition from other native plants that were familiar, that lived in their original area. So they tend to spread very fast and crowd out native species in that area and just decline the biodiversity. There's also about $120 billion a year that's spent on treating and monitoring invasive species around the U.S. So this is an example of what we were dealing with in the 1990s. This is what I had mentioned, monoculture. You can just see these are all glossy buckthorn stems. It's a woody shrub. It grows about 10 or 12 feet tall and just very high stem density. When they die, they fall over. They're covering the ground, so there's not any of the native wildflowers or grasses don't have a chance to grow because none of the sunlight is hitting the ground. So this is a condition we found the property in the 1990s. And so we embarked on restoring the landscape using 3 different techniques: invasives removal, restoring the hydrology, and prescribed burning. And this slide shows the invasive species removal. So this is a pile of buckthorn behind one of our land stewards here. You can see behind him there's just an impenetrable forest of buckthorn. That all needs to be removed by cutting it down at the base and treating it with herbicide. It's very labor and time consuming. Involves a lot of hand tools and power tools. And Just to allay any of your concerns about using herbicides in the environment, the herbicides that we use are wetland approved. They have very low impact on the environment, and they degrade very quickly. Oftentimes they'll degrade just by being exposed to sunlight for a few hours, and they break down into very safe compounds. In addition to this, we also are very judicious about applying them. So we apply them to individual plants instead of spraying them over large areas. And a big part of this particular restoration project was volunteers, almost 72,000 hours over 17 years. And that's the equivalent of the Nature Conservancy having about 10.5 people that they hired. But instead of having to hire those people and spend the money, these are all dedicated, really environmentally concerned citizens in the local area. And they come out every Saturday between April and November. They work for half a day removing buckthorn and applying herbicide and just enjoying the wildflowers and being out in nature. I mentioned hydrologic restoration was the second technique we used. You can see here in these diagrams how drainage tiles and ditches really change the hydrology of an area. Wetland plants really like what's called having their feet wet. They like having their roots in saturated soil. But you can see by putting drainage tiles in, it lowers the water table, which is great for agricultural crops, but it's not good for native plant communities at all, especially wetland plant communities. So what we had to do is go through and remove these manually. And in the 40s, drainage tiles were just short little sections of ceramic tubing. And so we had to dig those out by hand. We couldn't really use any heavy equipment because the ground is too soft, especially if it's wet, and they would cause a lot of ground disturbance, so we had to do it all by hand. And we found when we removed these drainage tiles, we ran into a little bit of a problem because we had these wide expanses of bare soil, and when it would rain or when the water table came back up, it would start flowing down there and we'd get erosion problems. So we inserted these tongue and groove bored dams to break up the water flow and give the vegetation a chance to recover. And then prescribed fire was a third technique we used. As I mentioned, this is a fire-dependent community, and the plants and animals really depend on this disturbance process to be successful in survival and reproduction. And the next series of slides is just sort of a photo history of a particular site. This is, again, the monoculture buckthorn you see here. And January 3rd, the next day, we cleared it all out and piled it up, and we burned these brush piles in the winter just to remove the dead material. But that just opens it up. And then, so if anyone wants to say, move that bus, thank you. Then here's what we came out with before and after. These plants, even after being abused, having the environment change, the water table lowered, and being overshadowed basically by buckthorn for 10, 15, 20 years. The seeds are just sitting in the seed bank waiting for the sun to get down to the ground level, heat them up, and provide the right conditions, and they spring right out. So we have a nice natural community. It saves us trouble. We don't have to buy seed and put it out there. They're really resilient communities if you just provide the right conditions for them. So these plants just sprung back up in about 8 months or so. And I had mentioned the drainage tiles removed, and you can see those fill in quite nicely with native plants, and now there's no erosion problems and no stream flowing, but these are all wetland plants, and so the water table has come right back up to the surface. And again, these are just in the soil. They come up on their own. We didn't have to do any planting. So after the restoration, this is ranked as one of the top 3 fins in all of Michigan. And that ranking is done by Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and it's based on size, condition, and the landscape context. So the size is just the overall size of this particular site. When we started in 1990, there was about 5 acres in little pockets in this preserve, and we expanded that to 100 acres. And the largest fen patch that we have now is probably about 40 acres in size, and then there's a couple smaller ones, but we've expanded it dramatically. And then, so I mentioned the second ranking criteria is condition, and that's just sort of the number of plants at this site. We have over 700 plants on this preserve. That includes both the fen and floodplain forest and some uplands. And then the third criteria is a landscape context, just if there's any immediate threats from development or agriculture at the site that might degrade it. And this site is in good condition in the landscape, and so it's very highly ranked. And so this project took about 17 years to complete, $2.5 to $3 million, and just tens of thousands of hours between the volunteers and the staff. But the cost, the investment doesn't end there. We have to continue going out there every year doing maintenance, just like you do maintenance on your house, to make sure it stays in good condition. We have staff going through there checking to make sure there aren't any new invasives and that there aren't any other problems that we need to address. So as I mentioned, success, one of the top 3 fens in the state, 100 acres, 700 different plant species that we've identified, and over a dozen species of state and federally listed species. So the next site, extreme makeover, that I want to describe to you is our Eastern Lake Michigan Coastal Invasives project. And that occurs on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, and it extends from the bridge all the way down to the Indiana state line. So dune systems are globally rare and unique. The one in Michigan around the Great Lakes is the largest freshwater dune system in the world, so it's important to protect. And it consists of several smaller communities like open dunes. You see here, there's some forested dunes that have been there a while. They've been there so long that they actually have full-grown trees on them. And then these small wetland pockets. You can see in this picture on the right, sort of striations or stripes. So these are old shoreline edges, dunes, and then between the dunes you get little wetland pockets. So it's very diverse mix of different communities there. And those communities support very unique species, many of which are endemic to the Great Lakes, which means they don't occur anywhere else in the world except right here. And those include pitcher's thistle and piping plover. So in 1999, the Michigan Dune Alliance was formed. It was a sort of consortium, a coalition of partners that came together and decided that the dunes and shoreline of this particular coast were particularly important to preserve. So they focused originally on coordinating and building capacity amongst themselves, but in about 2003 or so, the Nature Conservancy took a larger role, and we started focusing more on invasive species management because, based on a 2001 report, that was the primary threat to this particular coastline and the dune system. So there was a survey of 42 different sites, cataloging the invasive species, sort of get a large-scale, high-elevation overview of the extent of the problem. So once we had that in hand, we could start coordinating with other partners and collaborating and planning attack. And one of the invasive species that was causing a major problem that we decided to work on was baby's breath. So this is from Eastern Europe and Siberia. It was brought to the U.S. again as an ornamental and later used in flower arrangements, as you see here. But when it escapes cultivation or nursery areas, it can cause a big problem. So it just starts spreading out. Plants are relatively large. And over time, they can cover vast fields. So all this little purple haze that you see throughout this area is all baby's breath plants. You can see again, as with the buckthorn, this forms a monoculture. There's not much diversity there. There aren't many other plants growing there, especially not native plants that we want to see there. And baby's breath is particularly bad for the dune system because dunes are naturally dynamic. The sand shifts from water and wind, and you can see that there's really not any area here for wind or any water to stir up the sand. So it really changes the entire ecosystem by stabilizing the dunes instead of having them naturally shifting. And here's an example of an individual plant. you can see the ground would naturally be right here. This is all just a deep, thick taproot. So they're very well anchored, and like I said, they stabilize the dunes that way. So we restore these areas using two means. One is what we would call a mechanical in restoration field, and that just means we use a tool to attack it. So we would insert a shovel down below the ground and sever this taproot. Because if you just go through and cut it right at the ground level, it'll grow back out again. So we needed to get underground to sever that. And then again, we also used herbicides in areas, especially if there were vast areas. We might use herbicide, but again, it's safe for the environment and breaks down very quickly. So again, in 2006, when we started the project, you can see a big area of baby's breath here, and in the back you can see what it should look like. This is more natural back here. Lots of open space for the sand to move around, and that's what the local plants and animals are adapted to. And that area either hasn't been invaded yet or we've already cleared it out. So again, if everyone can join in, move that bus, then here's what it looks like. You can see much more open. One of the things that we saw after we did this work is pollinators, bees and other plants that actually pollinate local plants were much more abundant in these areas. Now another component of this particular project is early detection, rapid response, and that just means we're on the lookout for new invasive species or common invasive species that are maybe at a very small size in a local, in a particular location. And this is really the most efficient and effective way to address these restoration efforts related to invasive species, because if we can jump on them quick and take care of them before they spread across large fields or entire landscapes, then it's just much more time and energy efficient. And so using the house analogy for the extreme makeover, this is equivalent to fixing a leaky pipe or making sure that you spray your house for pests just before the pipe breaks and it floods your basement and you're taking care of it up front. It's basically an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So this is a kudzu patch. You can see we've started clearing it here. A lot of and then cleared this whole hillside, was covered in kudzu, and we've ripped it all out and put it on the shoreline here where it can be hauled off. So again, if you don't do early detection and rapid response, this is where you turn out. Kudzu, if you're not familiar with it, is known as the vine that ate the South. It covers just enormous areas down in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and these are trees, they're dead because it just overshadows them the same way that buckthorn shades out the plants on the ground. This kudzu will just grow up and it completely blocks any light from getting to tree leaves, and so it kills these trees and just moves across the landscape. So as I mentioned before, this is really more of a regional approach. There was a widespread survey done of invasive species across this whole shoreline, and we really wanted to match the invasive species up with the different partners and where those partners' service areas were, where they had staff working. And by doing that, we can be much more efficient with assigning resources, sending people out to certain areas that are nearby their offices, and it can just be much more efficient that way. So we've mapped out the invasives and where each partner has easy access or they have land. And by using this, so we've effectively coordinated invasive species monitoring along 500 miles of shoreline. And we also use an online database using technology and GPS to track this problem. So here you see an individual dot, a problem. Each one of these little pinpoints here represents an invasive species infestation of one sort or another. There's information on when the data was collected, what kind of invasive species was there, maybe whose property it's on, how big the patch is. And so by using this information, we can more effectively coordinate our removal efforts. And then pulling back and looking at a larger scale, you can see these symbols represent how many of those smaller points are represented by each one of these. So the purple ones, lavender ones, are thousands of smaller points of invasives that need to be addressed. The reds are hundreds, and then some yellows are just in the tens. So that helps us prioritize where we do our work. And the success outcomes of this project to date, over 36,000 acres of public and private lands have been surveyed for 15 high priority invasive species, and in many cases we've reduced those populations by up to 75% by the work of the Nature Conservancy and coordinating with our partners. Also addressing, as I showed, the kudzu, limegrass, phragmites, and over half of the dune systems that were infested with baby's breath have received treatments. So this project is in its 8th year, and we figure there's probably a couple years left to finish up the work that we want to do. It's been about $3.2 million so far, and there's maybe another $1 million worth of work to do in this landscape to get it to the point where it's at what we call a maintenance level, which means it's relatively low labor and time cost just to send someone out to check the areas that we've already cleared and make sure that there aren't any new developing problems. The third extreme makeover is our Two-Hearted Watershed connectivity project. So the Two-Hearted River is up in the Upper Peninsula, and it is one of the only free-flowing water river systems in the Great Lakes. Basically, that just means that there aren't any existing dams or impoundments along it. It's also the only river that's designated as a wilderness river by the state of Michigan. But despite having very few impoundments and being in relatively good condition, it does have some problems, and those include sedimentation and connectivity, what we call connectivity, which means basically fish being able to swim all the way up to the headwaters from the mouth, being able to pass all sections of the river and having access to that area. And so these problems, sedimentation and lack of connectivity, are caused primarily by road stream crossings. And those are basically areas where the roads cross the stream or river channel. And there might be bridges there or culverts, or there might just be areas where people drive their four-wheelers and trucks across the stream. There's not any formal sort of bridge. So in 2009, there was a survey done to inventory all these areas, and then the Nature Conservancy built on that to inventory the entire watershed. And you can see here we've mapped out where all the problems are. These are all the road stream crossings within the watershed, and we've ranked them whether they're a full barrier, which means that a fish would not be able to cross that point even during flood events in high water. Then partial barriers, where fish might be able to cross that particular barrier when there was a flood stage or high water. And then other ones that are not particular barrier. So we identified 29 total road stream crossings, and 19 of those we felt were important enough that they really needed to be addressed and restored. And this photo shows some of the problems that we're dealing with. So there's a road here crossing. The stream flows through this culvert. It's relatively small in size. It's pointing directly at the facing bank, so it causes erosion here. So not only is it a problem for sedimentation and bad water quality in the stream itself, but it's impacting the adjacent terrestrial upland area. And that's an additional problem for dealing with restoration. And then in many of these areas, if these culverts are undersized, if they're not big enough for the amount of water flowing through them, you'll actually get water flowing through so fast that it actually erodes this area just outside the culvert. And what that does is it creates what we call a perched culvert, which means that the culvert is actually, it might be 1, 2, 3 feet above the stream bed on the downstream side. And that's a big problem for fish that want to swim up and gain access to the upper parts of the river. They can't jump up that high and swim up to the other areas. So here's an example of one of the restoration sites. You can see the 3 culverts. They're different sizes. It looks like they were put in at different times. When we get flood events, there's probably water actually flowing over this berm. So there's a lot of problems with this particular site. And I think we have another bus here. Move that bus. And so this is what it looks like afterwards. We've widened the channel. We've solve the erosion problem along the banks by putting rocks in, which basically acts as a barrier to the water flow. And it's just much more fish friendly to be able to swim up and down here. And trucks and other vehicles have easy access across it without having any detrimental effects. And this shows a schematic, one of the engineering diagrams that we would use for this particular project. And just note down here at the bottom, these are the 3 culverts that were in there. They had a total passage area or opening of about 32 square feet. The area under the entire bridge that we put in was 244 square feet. So it's almost a 7-time increase of the amount of area that the fish have available to swim through there, and we don't have problems with flooding events. The bridge is plenty high enough to allow lots of water to flow through there when the water is high. So we've replaced 11 of these problem 19 aquatic barriers, and we have funding in hand at this point through federal, public, and private dollars to address some of the remaining ones. Here's just another example of one of the road stream crossings that we restored before. It's just showing that it's relatively simple, cheap to fix these problems. Just a matter of putting your mind to it, inventorying them where they are, and finding some dollars to put towards them. Then afterwards, you can see a change. Just note these concrete pads on each side. What we did with this particular project is we have a portable bridge, and so that can be moved up and down the road as need be. So we have some sustainable forestry that we do along this road, and we can place this bridge in certain areas depending on whether there might be a harvest occurring, and when there's not some need to have road traffic there, we can remove it. And by replacing something like this, we're reducing 98% of the sediment that was getting put into the stream. So the benefits of this project, water quality protection and improvement through sediment reduction, the project that we're keeping from going into the stream. So that's the equivalent of about 23 dump truck loads of sediment that was going into the stream that we've prevented. So that improves water quality, it makes better fish habitat, and it keeps that sediment from going all the way out into Lake Superior. We've also improved the aquatic habitat and connectivity for fish. So we've opened 35 miles of river is now open for fish to use. It wasn't before. And then, as I mentioned, the adjacent terrestrial habitat, we've done some grass and tree plantings to control the erosion in the adjacent shorelines. And then the final project that I want to describe to you today is our Erie Marsh Coastal Restoration Project. This is in extreme southeast Michigan. This is an aerial view of the site. It's a diked wetland, which basically means it's a wetland with an earthen berm around it. The conservation need of this particular site, Western Lake Erie, is one of the most productive and biologically diverse areas in the Great Lakes just because there's shallow, warm water, which is good for productivity. But only about 5% of the original wetlands in this particular landscape remain. But it's important for migratory waterfowl, shorebirds, and land birds. So it's important to protect it, imperative that we protect what remains. However, just because of the past land use practices at the site, in this entire landscape, there's some challenges for coastal wetland management. And this map shows some of those landscape challenges. All the pink is urban areas. All this yellow or tan is agricultural areas. So the coastal wetlands that remain are really confined to immediately adjacent to the water, to the Lake Erie water. So there's not very many of them left. Some of them are in bad shape. And so we wanted to work on restoring them. The project I'm describing is right down here where this cluster of stars is. And historically, to prevent these wetlands from being degraded, managers put the dikes around wetland areas. And basically what that did is that protected the area in lake level changes. If the water dropped too far, then all of the wetland plants would die. And then if the next year it came back up and was too high, it would just completely obliterate that site in terms of wetland quality. So by putting a dike around it, we can prevent water from being too high in the high years and keep water there even when it's too low in the lake in the other years, so we can preserve the wetland communities in the face of changing water levels. And our objectives for this project, when we started, the diked wetland had been segregated from the open lake for 60 years. So no fish were able to get in there, and there wasn't a hydrologic connection. We wanted to reestablish that. We also wanted to just improve the quality and the size of the wetlands within the diked area. So we wanted to have a mix of deep open water that might be useful for fish, emergent marsh, which the waterfowl like, moist soil or mud flats for shorebirds, and then some upland areas, lake plain prairie, which is a very rare plant community in upland areas. But we're also controlling invasive Phragmites at this site. And as I mentioned, providing some climate resilience, so in the face of changing water levels, we can maintain high quality wetlands right along the shoreline. And also community outreach. There are about 6 or 7 million people in the metropolitan Detroit and Toledo areas. This particular preserve, Erie Marsh Preserve, is a big birding spot. There's areas there for hiking and bird watching and photography. So we wanted to really foster the community involvement and recreational use. There's a little bit of a little bit of background for Erie Marsh. It was established in 1870 by a private hunting club, and the club members, when somebody joined, they had to basically bring some land with them. They had to have an adjacent area, and so over time it grew to about 2,200 acres. The wetlands were diked in the 1950s, and then in 1978 the Nature Conservancy bought it from the hunting club, and working with Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge and Ducks Unlimited, we came up with a restoration and management plan for the site. And I'll just mention that this site is sort of unique because it has a long history of wetland research and management. And it was a site that was used to demonstrate the detrimental effects of lead poisoning on waterfowl, lead shot on waterfowl. And it's also used to demonstrate the proper watering, dewatering of individual units for good management practices. So the conditions that existed when we started the project, this is how they used equipment. They used energy, basically, fossil fuel and electricity to get water from one area to another within the diked wetland. These were what we call the water control structures, what controlled water moving from one site to another. And this is just a piece of plywood down under the water here. These are rickety, outdated, they're prone to failing, and they leak even when they're not in bad shape. Also erosion problems, either just from the bad original construction or because there's muskrat problems in the area. And then also the water distribution canals around the site were just choked with invasive species, and the roads were very narrow, so it limited access in some areas. And then the existing pump structure, which was put in the 70s, this only pumps one way, and just note that this is a water level over here. It's actually pumping water up about 10 feet to pump out of the wetland. So again, there's a lot of fossil fuel energy involved, and so we wanted to make this a little more climate smart and easy on the environment. And this pump only pumps one way. It pumps out. So again, this is blocked out from fish passage. Any of the fish that's out in the open bay and lake doesn't have access to this site. So this is what the site looked like when we started the project. There are 6 what we call management units, which basically means an area that has a dike around it. So it's an area that we can sort of control independently. I mentioned invasive species. When we started this project, the entire site is about 1,000 acres, and 300 acres of that was monoculture Phragmites. So there was a huge Phragmites problem there that we wanted to control. And I'll just point out that this one unit here, you can see how large it is. This is really a problem for wetland managers, because if we have 3 feet of water down here in this area, up in the far corner it might be completely dry. And in order to really manage for a particular wetland type, we need to have the capacity to flood each area more or less uniformly. And so this is what the new design looks like. You can see that's broken up into 3 different units, so we'll have better control over each one. We've added 4 units, so now there's 10 different units. This water distribution canal that snakes up through the entire site has a water control structure into each one of these units, so we can control each unit independently. And it basically works off what we call head pressure. We pump a bunch of water into this distribution canal, and then we open a valve, and it flows by gravity into a unit. And so that removes the need for fossil fuels and active energy to flood and dewater particular areas. And this is a big construction project, lots of heavy equipment, dirt moving, constructing the water distribution canal, constructing the fish passage and pump structure here adjacent to the bay. And as I mentioned also, the Phragmites management, that involves basically 3 components. Spraying with herbicide. We usually do that with a helicopter, because this is, again, a monoculture of Phragmites. There's nothing else growing there. There aren't any native plants that we're concerned about damaging with herbicide. All the herbicide we put down is going to hit Phragmites and kill it. And once it's dead, we just remove the standing dead matter by something like this Marshmaster vehicle, which has mowing deck on it. So we go through and mow it, or we might burn it to get rid of that standing dead material. And then the final and critical stage of Phragmites management is being able to flood those areas up to maybe 2 or 3 feet. And that really drowns out the roots. If any of them happen to still be alive after the herbicide application, then they'll be dead after they've been flooded for a year or 2. So again, the before and after of this project. This is the last bus. Move that bus. And so this is what it looks like now. This is a new fish passage and pump structure. You can see we have individual controls for each gate, so we can more easily control the water where it's moving around the site. And instead of having to pump water up and over the dikes, this is all gravity fed. This is a long tube that extends down to the bottom of this dike. There's a perpendicular tube, and we can control water level. There's basically what's called a bunch of stop logs. This is just a series of metal boards that slide in one on top of the other, and by removing one or removing several of them down to the depth that we want, we can get water to flow over from one side to the other and control the water level in individual units. I mentioned the gravity feeding and the new hydrologic connection, but also carp exclusion grates. You can see those right here. And basically what that does is it keeps invasive carp out of the area. When they get into a wetland area, they tear up the submerged aquatic vegetation, they stir up the water and the mud on the bottom, and they really lower the water quality of the site. So we wanted to keep them out. But you can see a lot of our native fish species are sort of narrow if you look at them straight on, but the carp are sort of squashed. They're fat, wide, so they can't get through these grates, but the native fish can. Our work here to actually demonstrate the benefits. We're monitoring fish, birds, plants, and water quality, and also the reptiles and amphibians. And I just wanted to show this as an example that Erie Marsh is the diked wetland, and this is outside the dike. This is the different fish species and how many there are. You can see that just by the blanks. on one side or the other, that there's drastically different fish populations outside the diked area than there is inside it. So what we really want to do is get a more similar fish community inside the dike. So the benefits of this project, as I said, the recreation, lots of birding and hiking at the site, water purification, filtration capacity. These are all sort of ecosystem benefits, and reestablishing the hydrologic connection between the diked wetland and the bay and the lake outside. And also the species benefits, fish, waterfowl, shorebirds, native mussels, and native plants and listed species. So this project has a price tag of about $6 million or so. We have about $4 million for it. We're still actively looking for the other two. We've been projecting that it's probably going to take about 8 years to complete. So we're most of the way there at this point. I think with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know where I read it, but very recently I read that, again, there's major concern over the western part of Lake Erie, that the algae blooms and that are all coming back.
Yep, so the question was about the algae bloom problems in western Lake Erie. I don't know if you came to the last presentation that Mary Fales did, but a lot of that has to do with agricultural uses farther up in the watershed, sediment problems and fertilizer runoff from agricultural fields getting out into the lake and then making it even more productive than it is naturally, which is a bad thing to have it too productive, because then you get all these algae blooms. So that's something else that the Nature Conservancy and other agencies and partners are working on.
So what are we looking at in this picture? What are all these?
This is Erie Marsh. These are American lotus, which is a state-listed species, and it occurs in abundance down around Erie Marsh.
How big are they? I mean, I can't, mosquito, I can't figure out mosquito.
They're, you know, probably a foot, foot and a half in diameter, the scale of the lotus.
Are they rolled up? Is that it? They open up in the daytime?
Yep, they'll open up flat, like you see one here is open flat. I think it just depends on how old they are, and yeah. There's a,
How about this Humboldt Marsh? Where are you from Humboldt?
okay, where is this site from Humbug Marsh? This is down, if you know where Erie and Monroe, Michigan is, and Humbug Marsh is up right at the mouth of the Detroit River.
Is that Point Malay area?
Point Muley is in between Humbug Marsh and us. So it's all within probably a 25, 30 mile stretch of the coast. Yes, ma'am.
When you remove your glossy buckthorn, I know you have a nice seed bank of natives, but what happens to all the seed bank of buckthorn? Because I know
Good question.
you remove buckthorn and you get lots of baby buckthorn.
Yep, so the question is what happens with the seed bank of the glossy buckthorn, and that's why I mentioned that there's ongoing maintenance costs. We send staff out there, and it might take 5, 6, 7 years to deplete the glossy buckthorn seed bank. So they go out there every year and they either hand pull those new sprouts or they'll spray them with a little bit of herbicide to kill them. But that's one of our long-term maintenance needs. We just go out there every year and treat them because it causes a problem if there might be a tree in the middle of an open area like a fen. The birds love to come land there and poop, and so you get all the seeds down around that area. So we just have to watch for that and address it every year. Other?
Prevalent issue around here, and I know that's out.
Yeah, so the question is if kudzu is a big problem up here, and no. Fortunately, for kudzu in the Great Lakes, we're at the early detection rapid response phase. There are very few populations. They're relatively small, and so we get on them as soon as possible and remove them, and so it is not a problem up here at this point. Yes, sir.
Is there any progress on the biological controls for buckthorn and evergreens? Places that are experimenting with different people?
Yep, so the question was biological control for buckthorn and Phragmites. Those are both in the works. They're actively working on them. Like you said, there's a weevil for buckthorn. One of the things that they're working on for Phragmites is called gene silencing. If you can somehow, instead of using herbicide, you use a different chemical and it turns off the reproductive the genes that cause them to grow seed heads, or it stunts their growth, then that might be another option for controlling Phragmites. Just things like that constantly being developed. They just don't have anything that's approved for widespread use at this point. Yes, ma'am?
Another thing about kudzu, I remember reading a Wall Street Journal article, and they said there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. You can't chop it down, you can't, apparently fire doesn't even get rid of it. And on the way to Georgia, where I have relatives, I mean, it's just taken up both sides of the road. Everything is dead.
Yep.
Covered with kudzu.
Yes, that's correct. Just the question is about the kudzu issue down south. Interestingly enough, though, if this problem had been jumped on soon enough, livestock can actually control kudzu. They'll eat it, and they'll eat the fruit that's produced from it. But at this point, when it's 100 feet up in a tree, or it's just adjacent to highways and interstates, you can't have cattle and goats running around, so it's just gotten too far out of control, and it's just sort of a classic case of missing that opportunity for early detection and rapid response. Yes?
Yes, I have a question about Phragmites. It seems like I would consider Phragmites the kudzu of Michigan.
Yes.
And I wondered if there's a statewide effort being made to control this. I mean, at state level, I was hoping maybe the governor or somebody would do something like that.
Yep, so the question is about statewide effort to control Phragmites. And yes, there is a, the state DNR had a symposium a few years ago to bring all the people together, different agencies and conservancies together to address this issue, and they actually developed a statewide strategic plan. And from what I hear, the governor is considering some money that's earmarked specifically for invasive species control for what we call cooperative weed management areas, CWMAs. So if you're part of a CWMA, you can get some apply for a grant and get some money either for Phragmites or garlic mustard or spotted knapweed or whatever might be a problem in your area.
Does that include municipalities?
Yes, yeah, that would be open to everybody. It hasn't been official and pushed through yet, but it's something that's in the works. Probably just by keeping in touch with the state DNR. Yep. Any other? Yes.
What are the top 3 new invasives that the public should be aware of and watch for?
We just had this conversation through email about so. You know, some of them might not necessarily be plants. There's a big feral pig problem in the state in Michigan right now. It's in, I think, 63 or 69 of the counties. And if you know about that issue at all down in Texas or Florida, it's just gotten to be like kudzu down in that area. It's too far gone to really even think about controlling it. So that's one that I'm concerned about personally, is they just have a huge impact on rooting up and tearing up local rare plant communities. Pardon?
Where are they located? Are they runaway agricultural animals?
No, generally they either escaped from farms, or a lot of them escaped from hunting facilities. They're brought in for a hunting opportunity, but they're so big and burly that a deer fence won't necessarily keep them in, so they break through fences and get out into just the general landscape. But there's concentrations down, like in Washtenaw County area and up in Saginaw Bay area and like Gratiot County are some of the heavier concentrations of them.
So 2 and 3?
Oh, the 2 and 3 for new invasives. You know what? One of the things that the DNR is working on now is mute swans. Those can be a big problem. There is the the trumpeter swans are okay, but the mute swans are becoming a big problem, and the DNR actually has an annual control effort for those. As far as plants, one of the things we've been keeping an eye on in western Lake Erie is frogbit. It's just a little, looks like a little disc, like a dollar weed, if you're familiar with those. It looks like a small little lily pad. It grows in water, but it's another bad invasive species. Frogbit.
Thank you.
Any? Yes.
In the two-hearted river watershed, how much effect did the forest fire of several years ago have on sedimentation, and how long do those kinds of effects last?
Yeah, so the question is about the Duck Lake fire. Is that the one you're thinking of? Yeah, and how that affected water quality in the river system up there. I don't know of any actual monitoring programs for it, but what we've been keeping an eye on is it really seems micropopulations, which are good for keeping insects under control. So there are some unexpected consequences. I'm sure there are some increased sediment problems just during heavy rains, but I don't have any hard numbers for you about that. It's 8 o'clock. Did we want to, I'm happy to take more questions or talk to you afterwards out in the lobby. Thank you. Oh, and I did want to mention, before everyone takes off, we do have a spring treasure hunt Saturday, May 3rd out at our Western Preserve. So if you want to come out, we'll be identifying plants and birds and looking for frogs and salamanders, stuff like that. And then here's some more information about the Nature Conservancy if you're interested.